guys. Today we are going to read chapters 4 through 6, 4, 5, and 6. Yesterday we read chapters 1 through 3, so we started the I Survived the American Revolution book, and it started out with the actual war, him in the middle of the war, and then it flashed back to before the war. So it talks about Nate is the main character, and it talked about how he's having to live with his mean uncle that is against the revolution. So he is loyal to the king, which makes him a loyalist. And we talked about how that he is making life completely miserable pretty much for Nate, and how he has a slave, Eliza, and Eliza has a son, Theo. And at the end of chapter 3, we talked about how that the uncle, Storch, accidentally was hit by Theo in the head, and how
I did this, my plotty plates, they boom.
It's okay, go on back in there. Let mommy read the book. That is funny. I'm sorry, guys. My child just spilled all his Frosted Flakes, and he thinks that's hilarious. So, all right. So let's get back to it. Hopefully, he won't come in here and try to talk about it again. So, we want to learn this next chapters. We're talking about what happened to how Nate's uncle reacted. So let's think about how that slaves were kind of the position of that slavery was during that time. They are African American. They were probably Southerners, but Middle or Southerners because of the slavery. So let's go ahead and start reading chapter 4. So after we read chapter 4, 5, and 6, we're going to go and look at the questions and answer those questions, and you'll submit those. Okay. Nate's mind swirled. He was afraid he might vomit. It wasn't Scorch's moans of pain that sickened him. It was knowing what would happen to Theo. Storch would sell him for sure. Eliza would lose him forever, just like she lost her husband Gregory. Nate rushed over to Theo, who was trying to hide behind the cherry tree. Nate lifted Theo up and hugged him close. Eliza was on the porch now, bending down to help Storch. Eliza looked up and she spotted Nate and Theo. Her eyes locked with Nate's, and in that split second, Nate could see she understood exactly what had happened. Nate had to get Theo out of there. Don't worry, Nate whispered to Theo. I won't let anything happen to you. But Nate's words seemed to scatter in the wind. Of course, he wouldn't just run off with Theo. Theo wasn't just any little boy. He was a slave. To Storch, Theo wasn't a person. He was a valuable property. Storch wouldn't let him go. He'd hire slave catchers. He'd offer a fat reward. He'd never stop looking. There was nothing Nate could do to help Theo unless an idea flickered in Nate's mind like a little flame. Storch hadn't seen Theo throw the stick, had he? His back had been turned. What if Nate could trick Storch into thinking someone else had thrown the stick? Then Theo would be safe. Nate put Theo down. Run behind the barn, Nate whispered. Never tell anyone what happened with that stick. You come too, Theo said, clinging to Nate's arm. Soon, Nate said, struggling to keep his voice steady. He hated lying to Theo, but he had no choice. Theo turned and dashed away. Nate stood up with clenched fists and shaking legs, and Nate made his way to where Storch was now sitting up. Eliza was pressing a rag against his bleeding head. I'm sorry, sir, he said. It was an accident. The stick flipped from my hand. Nate, Eliza whispered. Storch struggled to his feet, glaring at Nate with fury. If Storch's eyes had been cannons, they would have blasted Nate into the sky, and he lunged forward. Smack! He slapped Nate across the face. Nate staggered back, and his face felt like a scalded with boiling water. Tears sprang into Nate's eyes, tears of relief. That slap meant Storch believed him. That Theo was safe, at least for now, but Nate was not. Storch lunged forward and grabbed Nate by the throat. His hands were like iron claws with bulging eyes and blood-smeared face. Storch looked like a sea monster from Nate's worst nightmares. Nate struggled but couldn't break free from the choking grip. Eliza screamed, and the voice inside of Nate's mind screamed louder, "He's going to kill me." With the last ounce of strength, Nate whipped his arm up and bashed his fist into the side of Storch's head. Storch lost his grip and fell back. Nate took one last look at Eliza. "Go," she mouthed. Nate turned and ran. This is chapter 5. July 12, 1776, just before dawn in Connecticut. Nate's eyes snapped open. Hideous pictures flashed through his mind. A blood-streaked face, claw-like hands grabbing for his throat. He blinked hard to end this nightmare, to shake himself awake. But Nate understood. He was awake, but is hiding out in the woods about 3 miles from Storch's house. This is where he'd wound up after a breathless run. He'd sat there under the tree for hours, but in a kind of numb shock, trying to figure out what to do. Somehow he must have fallen asleep. It was now pitch dark. Strange sounds rose up around him. Clicks and buzzes and hoots and the rustling of invisible wings and paws. His jaw throbbed. His neck felt swollen and bruised, but even worse was the loneliness. He felt like a castaway clinging to a barrel in a stormy ocean. He'd made a giant mistake, and he realized, fighting back tears. He had to go back to Storch's, to Eliza and Theo. He stood up and started to make his way through the woods. Storch would be calmer now, Nate told himself, and whatever Storch might do to him, he'd have to just take it. But what choice did he have? He didn't have a single coin in his pocket or a scrap of food to eat. He was just a boy, alone in the world. Remember, guys, this is an 11-year-old boy. But then, as Nate walked along, he thought about another boy who had once been by himself, the pirate / O'Shea. Nate slowed down as he remembered the stories Papa used to tell him when Slash was a kid. He'd been born in London, England. His parents had died before he was 5 years old. He wasn't called Slash yet. Back then, he was just called Jonathan. With his parents gone, he wound up in a filthy orphanage, more like a prison than a home for helpless kids. The food was barely fit for pigs. The beatings were brutal. Finally, young Jonathan couldn't take it. When he was 10 years old, he ran away. So that pirate must have been terrified, Nate thought, like Nate was now. And there was no way he'd go back to that wretched orphanage. Jonathan, that pirate, got himself a job on a ship as a cabin boy, and he sailed away and he never looked back. Nate pictured a boy standing on the deck of a big sailing ship. The boy's face became clearer until it became Nate's own face. Nate blinked. Something inside of him shimmered. Suddenly, the night didn't seem so dark. If young Slash could go to sea, why couldn't he? Sure, Nate was young. Papa wouldn't hire cabin boys who were younger than 14. But Nate was bigger and taller than most 11-year-olds, and Papa had taught him to work harder than sailors twice his age. Nate quickened his step as he made his plan. New York City was about 50 miles south of here. He'd go to Norwalk Harbor. There were always boats heading down to the New York City, loaded up with vegetables or oysters or hogs to sell. Nate would hide out on one of those boats. If the winds and the currents were strong, he would be in New York by afternoon. The city had one of the busiest harbors in the colonies, with merchant ships heading to the Caribbean and Europe and all corners of the world. There had to be at least one captain willing to give Nate a chance. Nate could practically feel Papa's hand on his back, pushing him along. He saw Theo in his mind, with his bright and hopeful eyes, and he remembered the last word Eliza said to him, "Go." He made it to the harbor several hours later. The docks were already crowded with sailors and fishermen preparing for the day. And for once, Nate lucked out. At the end of the dock was the sailing ship Valerie. It made weekly runs to New York City, Nate knew. And its deck was already loaded up with baskets and crates, heaped with corn and potatoes and cherries. The sails were up. The ship was about to leave. There were only 3 men working on the small ship, and they were too busy working to notice when he slipped on board. He scurried across the deck and hid himself between the 2 big baskets of corn. A few minutes later, sailors pushed the boat away from the dock, and with a whoosh of wind, Nate was on his way. This is chapter 6. Nate stayed very still in his hiding place. His empty stomach churned with worry. Panicked thoughts spun around his brain. Would he ever see Theo and Eliza again? What if Eliza had to do all of Nate's work now? How could she watch over Theo? The rocking of the ship calmed him some. He listened to the familiar sounds, the swoosh, cracks of the sails, the creaks of the wood, the twang of the sailors' voices. Bright pictures filled his mind. Memories of visiting New York City with Papa. Some of their voyages had started from there, and Papa always left a day or two for them to explore before they set sail. New York City wasn't as big as Philadelphia, but it had 25,000 people. 25,000. That was more people than Boston or Charleston. New York was dirty and smelly, like every city Nate had ever visited. Garbage rolled in the alleys. Piles of horse poop steamed the streets. But Papa always said New York was the prettiest city in the colonies, and Nate agreed. The wide streets were lined with tall elm trees. Gardens were bursting with sweet-smelling flowers that almost covered up the garbage stink. Nate loved the sidewalk puppet shows and jugglers who spun torches on the street corners. Papa would tip his cap at the ladies swishing by in their bright dresses. But best of all was the food. Suppers of juicy rabbit stew and gooey boiled puddings and buttery dumpling that slid down Nate's throat. One restaurant was so fancy that they gave Nate and Papa each a fork. A fork! Even the most rich people like Stuart had to eat with a knife and their fingers. But Nate and Papa figured out that strange new tool of the fork pretty quickly. Nate's mind flashed with memories of Papa as the Valerie, the ship, sailed down the twisting coastline of Connecticut and New York. He shut up his grumbling stomach by sneaking a few ears of corn. The sun was high in the sky when they came to Manhattan, the island of New York. Most of the long and skinny island was wild land, rolling green hills and forests and marshes with just a few orchids and farms. It looked so quiet and peaceful. It was hard for Nate to imagine that busy New York City was just a few miles down on the island's southern tip. But slowly the city came into view. Nate spotted crooked rooftops, the wharves jutting into the river, and too many church steeples to count. The Valerie ship sailed towards the bottom of the island and turned into the wharves. Nate didn't bother waiting until Valerie was completely stopped. The moment it was close to the dock, he sprang up, and with a few steps and a leap, he was off the boat. One of the ship's sailors swore in surprise as Nate streaked past him, and Nate was gone before anyone could stop him. He ran down the dock, zigzagging around baskets and barrels and coils of ropes. There were only a few dock workers milling around and no big merchant ships. That was a little strange. Last time there were too many ships to count. The docks had been packed with sailors from all over the world, lugging crates and barrels and shouting out in languages he'd never heard before. But Nate wasn't worried. He'd probably come into a different wharf this time. It shouldn't be hard to find where the merchant ships were docked. A thrill rushed through him as he left the waterfront, his boots clicking against the city's familiar cobblestone streets. He'd made it, but as he plunged into the city, his excitement drained away. Why were some of the streets deserted? Go. Why were some of the streets blocked off by big dirt walls? He saw no puppet shows like he had before with Papa. No ladies in swishing dresses, no fancy coaches clattering through the streets. Most of the stores were boarded up. On one block, the only people around were men. Soldiers. Nate realized. He could tell they were American soldiers by their plain clothing. British soldiers were famous for their brass-buttoned red coats. That's where the nickname Red Coat came from. They wore spiffy leather hats and bright white shirts and belts with brass buckles. American soldiers didn't have uniforms. Most of them wore cheap felt and three-cornered hats and frontier shirts that tied with a collar. Those rebel soldiers looked like scarecrows, Storch had said. Looking around, Nate thought Storch wasn't far off. Most of the men wore dusty trousers and work shirts. Their weapons were beat-up muskets or rifles. The deeper into the city Nate walked, the more soldiers he saw. Most were hard at work. At the end of the streets, dozens of men were building another big dirt wall. Farther down, Nate saw 3 men pulling a cart carrying a huge cannon. What was happening here? The hairs on the back of Nate's neck prickled up. Nate suddenly remembered what Storch and Martin had been talking about yesterday as they ate their goose. Nate hadn't been paying close attention, but now Storch's words came back to him as though they were right next to Nate, barking in his ear. The king sends hundreds of ships. The big battle is coming any day. Washington and his army of traitors will soon be crushed. Nate figured Storch and Martin had been talking about Boston, Massachusetts. As far as he knew, that's where most of the fighting had been happening. But now, Nate realized that they had to have been talking about New York City. No wonder the docks had been mostly empty. No wonder the streets were deserted. There had been thousands of soldiers here. Most of the people living here must have left. And that's when Nate fully understood what he'd done. He escaped from Storch, but he had landed in the smack dab middle of the war. So that was those 3 chapters. So now we're getting into Nate is getting ready to be in the middle of this war that's happening. And remember, this war is the American Revolution, where the Americans fought to win their freedom from Britain. And remember that Nate's Uncle Storch did not like, he was a loyalist, he was loyal to the king, so he did not like these American soldiers. Remember, the American soldiers, we talked about them before, were rough looking, hillbilly, we've called them before, and Storch calls them scarecrows, but the British were all put together, and they had these nice big uniforms and these big nice rifles, big weapons, and they were ready for war. We know how the war ends, but Nate does not at this time. And remember, guys, he's 11. Some of you all are not even 11 yet, so this is a kid like you are, just going into this and getting ready to be in the middle of a war, and these different battles and stuff. So I want you to think about how you would feel if you were in the middle of this American Revolution. So after you finish watching this video, go ahead and answer the questions while it's fresh on your mind, and tune in tomorrow to see what happens tonight. Bye.